Welcome to this very special supplemental edition of Bible Journeys. I'm just going to add information to what was in the previous one about doing right, love the Lord your God. The fourth lesson. People misunderstood when I said that a particular text was used improperly, and they thought that somehow I was trying to say that the law was abolished. The Ten Commandments no longer mattered. Well, as I'm about to demonstrate, not only did I not believe that and was not trying to establish it, in fact, the process I'm using actually demonstrates that it doesn't say that. This passage does not say anything about the law being abolished. Quite the contrary. But let's go. I'm going to be very rapid here because this is supplemental. I just wanted to make sure and get this out while people perhaps are still a little bit concerned about this. This speaks directly to the issue of if you love me, keep my commandments, which people apparently misunderstood. And it's understandable because most of us aren't really taught how to study the Bible. We just sort of absorb it through osmosis. We see other people, Sabbath school teachers and pastors and so forth, doing this, and we just sort of copy it without recognizing what the process is. And so here it is. The passage is, and I was addressing the passage, not the doctrine. People thought I was addressing the doctrine of whether or not the law was still there. And of course, I believe the law of God is eternal. But let's look at how this works out and why the process that I was going, not only it demonstrates the point I was trying to make, but it also demonstrates that it's impossible that it would be saying the law was abolished. And here it is, this whole thing. We had it. If you want to see more about it, go to the original broadcast. I'll put links up to that, where I talked about the two different ways of approaching Scripture, proof texting versus textual evidence. And that was my first concern, was that we understand how this is done, so we know the difference. When someone uses a single text, they don't always have the time to describe it in detail, the process they went through. And so it's important that we know it, because then we know how authoritative the teaching is. If it's just something that they've decided on their own, then it's not very authoritative. If it is accurately reflecting what the biblical author wanted to say, then of course it has the authority of that biblical author. We're going to spend most of our time focusing on this part, this lower part of the process. But I want you to notice at the top that looking for textual evidence, the proper procedure starts out with a hypothesis. Does this say, or it's a question. It can be either one, a hypothesis. If this is that, then what is the result? Or it can be, what does this say? Just as simple as that. Whereas proof texting starts out with, I know what is true and I'm looking for evidence to back it up. So we'll be looking at that one section. Again, textual evidence begins with a hypothesis or question. We search for keywords and concepts, and then we ask what words did the author use, as opposed to proof texting, which says, well, I know, for example, the law of God is eternal. And if I find the word commandment anywhere, then that tells me something about the law, the Ten Commandments. And without thinking about them, these ones are in gray because we're not nobody is starting out, I should say almost nobody's ever starting out with the purpose of deceiving another person. That's not what's going on. It's just that we've learned to think certain way. We're not even aware that we're thinking this. Again, we have absorbed this process through osmosis, and we just do it without really thinking about what it is that we are doing. But what I set out to do was does this text, if you love me, keep my commandments, does it refer to the Ten Commandments? Simple as that. And research for keywords and concepts. I won't go into concepts. That's a whole other presentation. I want this supplement to be relatively short so we can just address this one question that people seem to have. And the first question is, what words did the author actually use? And there's this whole chart. We're going to just take this down. Commandments, if we assume that commandments always means the 10 Commandments. No, think about that. It makes kind of sense. It says commandments, it must mean the commandments. And according to that, then Jesus is affirming the 10 Commandments and the 10 Commandment law. And the problem is, you see, there's a gap there. And the gap is because there have been steps left out. Again, it's not something that people are even aware of for the most part. So we're going to look at this part of the process and ask the question, what words do the author use? And are they defined explicitly? If they're not, then are they defined contextually? So we were looking at what words do the author actually use in this passage, and are they defined? Those two questions. First of all, what words did he use? And it turns out that we're talking about the Greek words now, because command and commandments are a translation. And anyone can do this. It's online. You can go and find the Greek interlinear and find out exactly what the Greek word was. And you also can then go and find what the Strong's Concordance says is the most common usage. These are pretty commonly accepted tools. So the first one is in 1334. In 1334 through 1517, chapters 13 through 15, Jesus uses the word, which is translated commandments in the New King James, for example, no fewer than 9 times. 9 times. And so we're going to go through them one at a time very quickly and see what Greek word he used, the author. So 1334, he first used the word entole, which means precept. According to Strong's, the most common usage of entole is precept. But of course, you can see how it also could be a commandment. And that's the Greek word 1785. That's the Strong's number for this word. You can look it up yourself. Be happy to do that. Then in 1415, he uses entolos, which is still the same basic root word. It's just the plural. And in Greek, it's a little complicated because it's called an inflected language. And so how a word is used doesn't change the word, but it changes the spelling, which you can see. Entolos, precepts. So that's the next usage. In 1421, uses the same thing, entolos, precepts, and of course it's that same Greek idea, and it's the same Strong's number. Then in 1431, he uses this word entellato, to order, to direct, to give a command. It could be to give a commandment, that's fine. But you can see that this is according to Strong's, this is the more common usage of this word, to order. So there we go from 1431, and we can look at it. You can look up each one of these texts. So I'm giving them here. We're not going to take the time to mention each one here. Entolos in 1510, again, the same word as in 1415, and in the same Greek root as in 1334 and 1415. Precepts, concepts, however you want to look at this. 1512, part of this same little quotation. Entole, which is the precept, and the Greek 1785. The Strong's number is G1785. Again, you can look this up for yourself. In 1514, he uses entillato, which is, again, the same as in 1431, to order. The same Greek's number, so you can see that there. And then finally, the last in this passage is entillato. Again, same thing, to order. We have 9 usages here, and you can see the fact that the Strong's numbers are so close together shows you that the Greek words are very closely related to one another. So we have a very narrow usage repeated 9 times in this relatively short passage, and it's all in this address that Jesus is giving to his disciples after the Last Supper and before the crucifixion. So he's preparing them for his imminent death, and he's giving them these last instructions. So what words did the author use? Well, we see here, entole, entolos, which is just the plural of the other, entellato. 3 words. That's it. That is it. Very narrow, very similar words. So it's very clear the author has the same idea in mind repeatedly in this passage. Well, if we look at it, then it's interesting because we have a beginning and end to this passage, and it says, are they defined explicitly? Well, you can ask whether this is explicit or in the context, because it's in the context of this whole passage here. Either way, it's defined, and a really good speaker, a really good author, will always make sure that his audience understands what he's talking about, and he'll do that by beginning and ending with a clear statement. And that's what we find exactly here. Again, the texts are all listed. Feel free to look them up for yourself. And we just take these two texts, the beginning, the first mention and the last mention in this passage, we find that Jesus is very careful to define them. John is very careful to make clear exactly what is being described here. And Jesus did too, probably. I mean, John is reporting accurately, which we believe he is because he's inspired. And Jesus is being careful because this is the last big speech he is going to give them, the last directions he can give them before they face the crisis of the arrest and the crucifixion. And what do we find? The first verse. The first mention, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. Now, we saw that the Strong's definition, the most common usage was a new precept, a new precept I give you, a new idea, a new concept. It makes perfect sense here. A new precept I give you, that you love one another. That makes as much sense as saying this is a new commandment. It's not an addition to the 10 commandments. He's not saying these are the 10 commandments and here's a totally different one. Rather, he's giving them a new idea, a new understanding of the eternal law. And that is, you will love one another. Now, this is not uncommon because throughout the Gospels we find similar definitions by others. Now, they don't directly apply here, but we see that this is a similar concept throughout. That the fundamental part of the law is to love God and to love others. And here it is. I'm giving you this new idea, this new concept, this new precept, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And what is the last? When he closes off this thing, these things I command you, I direct you, I'm ordering you to do, I'm urging you to do, that you love one another. So you see, we have here in the beginning and the ending the mention of this very concept, the very same word, that he is giving a clear definition, that he wants this thing that he's commanding them, this precept that he's giving, this new idea, what he wants them to remember as he goes to the cross, that the most important thing is that they love one another. Does this mean that the 10 Commandments are somehow abrogated or abolished or done away with? Well, let's take a look. First of all, we want to go down here with this chart. Are they defined explicitly or are they defined contextually? Well, the answer is yes, eventually. Does this usage support your hypothesis or does it oppose the hypothesis? And this all depends on what your question is, what your hypothesis is. So let's take a look at that. My hypothesis, the reason I brought this up in the first place, was the commandments in John 14:15 does not refer to the 10 commandments. If you love me, keep my commandments. He's saying, if you love me, honor these precepts, do what I'm asking you to do, which is to love one another. And if that's the hypothesis, if that's the question, does the usage in all of this support it? The answer is yes, it does. John 14:15 does not refer to the commandments. It refers to this new precept, to this basic fundamental concept he wants them to understand, the purpose of the law. Again, the law doesn't, the notion that we should love one another is never going to go away. That'll continue throughout eternity. And so therefore the basis upon which the law is predicated will not change. The law will not change. No indication of that. But I'm just saying that's the whole point, is these don't refer directly to the Ten Commandments. He's not talking about that. He's talking about how he wants them to conduct themselves, this new idea that his example, he has come to show us, as I have loved you, he has come to show us what the love of God means in action. And he wants them to do for each other as he has done for them. That's really clear if you study this passage, this 13 through 15. And we just saw that the usage is there. But let's suppose, if it does not refer to the Ten Commandments, which is what my hypothesis is, then it cannot be claiming they were abolished or anything else about them. You see, my hypothesis simply says that he's talking about something else other than the Ten Commandments. Yes, it's the basis of the Ten Commandments that we love one another, but it is not the Ten Commandments. He's not saying, keep this list of things. He's saying, I want you to focus in on loving one another as I have loved you. That's the important part. And so if my hypothesis is right, it cannot be saying that the law is abolished, because it isn't talking about the law at all. And by the way, this is often happens, and we were trained about this in the seminary and other places, that you can't ask questions of the scripture, of the text, that the author is not talking about. And if in this passage Jesus is not talking about the Ten Commandments, then he can't possibly say that the Ten Commandments were abolished. They weren't. Now, if the hypothesis, if this is the proposed hypothesis, some people apparently think I'm trying to say that the Ten Commandments are abolished, does this usage support that idea? No. Does it oppose that idea? No. It just doesn't talk to it. And what that means is that this passage is irrelevant to that particular hypothesis. Doesn't mean it's irrelevant in the absolute sense. It's very important to understand the passage. It's just that when you ask about the Ten Commandments, it doesn't speak to those. That's it. Again, it's not irrelevant in an absolute sense. It's irrelevant to this particular question because it's not talking about them. If we were going to do the law, if I were going to try and do something about the law, then I'd have a big job ahead of me. I'd have to go back to the Old Testament first and understand how the idea and the precept of law developed throughout the Old Testament. That's part of the exegetical process we talked about biblical theology, understanding what they believed at a particular time. And so I'd have to go through the antediluvian world. What was the idea of law then? The patriarchs, Exodus, Judges, monarchy, the exile. And of course, these could be broken down in even the smaller units. And of course, the Hebrews, the Bible, the Jews look at the Old Testament as the law, the prophets, and the writings. And each of those has their particular function and their particular contribution to make concerning the law. And we have to say, how are they using that word? And this chart is incomplete because I didn't have enough time. I want to be sure to get this basic information out quickly. If we go to the New Testament, first of all, we'd have to look at the Gospels. Jesus talks about the law, and of course, he claims to be living that law. Again, I don't think the law is abolished. Quite the contrary. I just think the passage we were talking about in John 13 through 15 is not talking about the Ten Commandments. That's all. It's they're addressed in other places in John and other places in the Gospels, just not particularly in that passage. That passage is very clear. And read the text for yourself. Then you have Acts, because it shows the development of the ideas among the early church. And then you have the epistles, which are actually probably written before the Gospels. And the epistles are the various apostles and authorities writing to churches to explain. They're very much, I think, like the wisdom literature, Proverbs and so forth in the Old Testament. But of course, epistles also are they're very what we call occasional writings, that there oftentimes is a particular problem that's being addressed. And so you'd have to look and see, is that being addressed in this epistle? And of course, then there's the larger thing. You take all the epistles of Paul and see what his idea was and compare it with the epistles of John and the epistles of Peter and then Jude, James, the general apostles. And Hebrews, although I don't have any problem with Paul being the author, there's a lot of debate about whether Paul was the author, but Hebrews is a very interesting and singular book. So if we're going to understand, if I were going to talk about the law in the absolute sense, I would be dealing with this whole thing. I'm not about to do that in the space of a short video. But I think you can see, I think I've demonstrated, if you're concerned that I think the law is being abolished, then you have nothing to be concerned about, because I don't think that's true. I think that the law was fulfilled by Jesus. That doesn't mean that it disappeared. On the other hand, it means that he showed us how to live out the law, what it really means in action. And that's the important part. I could go on, and we will perhaps have videos about having a saving relationship. What does that mean, and how does that work? And we can talk about a lot of things. But for now, we just want to talk about, just wanted to make this clear, that the larger passage in John 13 through 15 is Jesus' valedictory, if you will. It's his last speech. He's giving his last sermon, his last advice. He's giving the disciples. They're about to face the arrest and the crucifixion. And of course, they can't remember the resurrection, because they don't remember the crucifixion, the death business. They've denied it. They refuse to believe it. And all this is about to hit them emotionally. And so he, as any conscientious leader and mentor wants to do, and of course he is himself divine and in contact with the Father, he wants to make sure that they understand what was the purpose. And he talks about in this whole thing about, I've come to show you the Father. And what he's come to show us is the Father loves us. The law, all 10 commandments, are demonstrations of God's love for his children. And that, since God's love will never end, it is eternal, then the law which is based upon his love will never end either. But we must understand it for what it is, which is the expression of God's love, and not for what it is not, requirements which we can never live up to. So I do not believe the law is abolished. And I think this, as we go through the process that I'm describing, again, it demonstrates that if I was trying to prove the law was abolished, I would never use that passage, because it doesn't have anything to do with the abolition of the law. It's not possible. And the rest of the scriptures, I believe, firmly establish that the law will continue. So this is, I understand the mistake. I understand the eagerness to defend a certain idea. Some of the comments have been a little, I think, unnecessarily strongly worded, and assuming negatives that either I or other people have harbored or expressed. But people get excited. We understand that. And I just wanted you to know this. This is, again, you probably want to, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll want to watch the video on the fourth lesson on present truth in Deuteronomy. And I'll put links both here and there. Thank you for your time. I won't take any longer. And this has been a rather interesting Bible journey together, and I hope that you'll share more of them with me, because I find the Bible to be a marvelous book full of treasures, and I want to share them with you. So until next time, God bless.